There's something deeply satisfying about a perfectly manicured lawn. No weeds, no dandelions, every blade of grass standing at attention like it's reporting for military inspection. We tend to think that's what health looks like. Not just in our gardens, but everywhere else. We want perfectly unified political movements, perfectly disciplined organizations, perfectly orthodox churches, and perfectly rational activist groups. If someone doesn't fit, well, the instinct is simple. Pull that weed. It feels like strength. It feels like progress. After all, who wants a messy garden? Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. Look, the problem with an immaculate garden is that nature doesn't actually work that way. A field with no diversity, no competing plants, and no ecological friction may look beautiful for a while, but beneath the surface, it's becoming dangerously fragile. Remove every challenge, eliminate every disturbance, and you've also removed many of the very forces that help living systems adapt and survive. The cleanest field can become the easiest one to destroy. Human communities aren't all that different. The moment a group becomes obsessed with ideological purity, whether it's religious, political, or even secular, it starts confusing agreement with health. Disagreement becomes disloyalty. Questions become threats. Before long, the goal isn't discovering what's true. The goal is protecting the group from anyone who might complicate the story. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. The fact that groups try to protect themselves from anyone who might complicate their story is why I think the core value of resolution, being resolute, deserves a second look. We usually imagine bravery as standing our ground or defeating an opponent, but maybe the greater courage is resisting the urge to purge. The greater act of courage is having enough confidence in our values to let them be tested by disagreements rather than insulated from them. So throughout the rest of this episode of Afterthoughts, I'd like to explore an idea that you may find surprising. The healthiest gardens aren't monocultures, and neither are the healthiest minds or the healthiest communities. If we really want resilience, we may need to stop fearing the weeds and start asking what they're teaching us. So let's stay in the garden for a moment, because modern biology has something fascinating to teach us about Jesus's farming metaphor. Industrial agriculture loves monocultures. Instead of growing a lot of different varieties of plants together, farmers generally plant enormous fields containing a single crop with nearly identical genetics. Every competing plant is sprayed away. Every pest is treated as an enemy. The result is a field that looks incredibly efficient, orderly, productive, and almost perfectly clean. The trouble is that clean, in this sense, doesn't really mean healthy. Biologists use the term ecological fragility to describe what happens when a system loses its diversity. If every plant is essentially the same, then a disease that can infect one plant can infect all of them. There are no natural barriers, no resistant individuals, and no backup plan. What looks strong from a distance is actually one of the weakest systems imaginable. Now, one of the best examples is the Gros Michel banana. Until the middle of the 20th century, it dominated the global banana market. But because commercial plantations relied on these genetically identical plants grown in these vast monocultures, a soil fungus known as Panama disease spread relentlessly through plantation after plantation. The industry, the entire banana growing industry, was nearly wiped out. Not because the fungus was unstoppable, but because the bananas had almost no genetic diversity to even slow it down. That lesson extends far beyond bananas. Healthy ecosystems aren't sterile. They contain competition and disturbance. They contain parasites and, yes, even weeds. Those pressures may seem inconvenient, but they're also what drive adaptation. They force organisms to evolve stronger immune systems, to develop new survival strategies, and to become more resilient over time. The irony is striking. The very things we try hardest to eliminate are often the things that keep a system healthy. Without challenge, growth stalls. Without friction, resilience fades. A perfectly clean field might look impressive, but evolution sees something very different. Evolution sees a system that's stopped learning and is just one unexpected threat away from collapse. Now keep that in mind, because human communities have a habit of building ideological monocultures that are just as fragile as agricultural ones. So now let's leave the garden and let's look in the mirror. Because this instinct doesn't stop with agriculture. It shows up anywhere human beings form groups around shared beliefs. Religious conservatives they're often criticized for policing orthodoxy and hunting for heresy. But progressives, secular humanists, libertarians, just about every other movement can fall into the same trap. It's a human tendency, not a religious one. It usually begins with a good intention, and a community wants to protect its values. So it starts drawing these very clear boundaries around who belongs. Before long, those boundaries become purity tests. A speaker isn't progressive enough. A candidate isn't rational enough. A new member doesn't use exactly the right language. Instead of asking, can this person help us move forward, the question becomes, do they agree with us on everything? The goal quietly shifts from solving problems to protecting ideological comfort. Psychologists and sociologists have observed a related phenomenon called horizontal hostility. That's when people reserve their sharpest criticism not for those who fundamentally oppose them, but for those who agree on almost everything while differing on a few important points. In other words, it's often easier to attack a potential ally over the remaining 10% than to work with them on the 90% that they already share with us. Why? Because disagreement creates tension, and tension is uncomfortable. It forces us to explain our reasoning, to reconsider our assumptions, and sometimes we have to admit that another perspective has something valuable to offer. Purity tests eliminate that discomfort. They simplify the world into insiders and outsiders, friends and enemies, wheat and weeds. But simplicity comes at a price. Every time we remove a thoughtful dissenter or dismiss someone who doesn't fit perfectly, we lose a little of our ability to adapt. Like a biological monoculture, an ideological monoculture might feel safe, but it grows increasingly more fragile. It becomes more interested in preserving agreement than continuing to discover truth. Resolution asks something harder of us. It asks us to stay in the conversation, to tolerate productive friction, And to recognize that a community that's strong enough to handle disagreement is almost always stronger than one that demands complete conformity. Now, let's go back to this week's gospel reading, because the parable of the wheat and the weeds suddenly takes on a whole new dimension. The servants look across the field and immediately spot a problem. There are weeds growing among the wheat, and their instinct is exactly what many of us would do. Let's get rid of them right now. A clean field feels like a healthy field. Purity feels safer than complexity. But the master refuses. His reasoning is surprisingly practical. The roots have grown together. If you rush in and start tearing out everything you've labeled a weed, you're going to damage the wheat as well. In other words, the cure may be worse than the disease. Sometimes wisdom means accepting a season of imperfection, because forcing a quick solution creates even greater harm. Now, when we read this through a secular lens, that's an incredibly insightful observation about human organizations. Every healthy community contains people who think differently, who ask uncomfortable questions, people who challenge accepted assumptions. Now, they're often inconvenient. They can slow meetings down. They can complicate decisions. But they're also the people who notice blind spots, who prevent groupthink. They're often the ones who build bridges between competing ideas. When a group becomes obsessed with ideological purity, those are usually the first people to go. The pragmatic voices are dismissed as compromisers. The independent thinkers are labeled as troublemakers. The bridge builders, they're accused of lacking commitment. The organization may become more unified in the short term, but it also becomes less resilient over time. That's exactly what we've been talking about with monocultures. A field made up of only one kind of plant is easy to manage, but it's also easy to destroy. The same principle applies to ideas. A movement made up of people who all think alike may feel strong, but it gradually loses its ability to adapt to a changing world. Perhaps that's the enduring wisdom hidden inside this ancient parable. Not every weed should be celebrated, of course. Some ideas really are harmful, but the answer isn't to mistake every disagreement for a threat. Being resolute requires the patience to distinguish between genuine danger and the productive friction that helps a community remain healthy, resilient, and alive. All right, here's the uncomfortable truth. Healthy communities are rarely comfortable communities. It's a hell of a lot easier to surround ourselves with people who think exactly like we do. Right? Meetings move faster, decisions feel simpler, nobody asks awkward questions or challenges our assumptions. But convenience isn't the same thing as health. Growth almost always comes with a little friction. That doesn't mean every idea deserves equal weight, or that every disagreement should be tolerated indefinitely. Some positions are genuinely harmful. The challenge is learning the difference between protecting people from harm and protecting ourselves from discomfort. Those are not the same thing. Real resolution isn't demonstrated by slamming the door on someone who fails an ideological purity test. Being resolute is demonstrated by having the confidence to keep the conversation going when there's still common ground to explore. It means sitting across the table from the candidate who agrees with you on 8 issues out of 10, right? Or the activist whose strategy differs from yours, or the neighbor whose life experience leads them to ask difficult questions. Now, that's not weakness. Staying engaged in those situations is not weakness. In fact, staying engaged in those types of conversations demonstrates the courage needed to build something bigger than your own certainty. Ironically, that's also how resilient ecosystems survive. Diversity doesn't eliminate conflict. It channels conflict into adaptation. Different organisms compete, cooperate, and continually reshape one another. The result isn't perfect order. The result is long-term strength. Human communities tend to work pretty much the same way. So here's my challenge for you this week. Stop trying to build a sterile garden out of your organization. Build a living one instead. Welcome thoughtful disagreement. Protect curiosity as fiercely as you protect your own convictions. If your community never stretches your thinking, it may be drifting toward the safety of a monoculture rather than the resilience of a healthy ecosystem. Being resolute isn't the courage to eliminate every weed. It's the courage to live, learn, and grow in a field that is beautifully, frustratingly, and unavoidably messy. That's where resilient people are made. And that's where resilient communities take root. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for different age groups. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. The guide provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.